FIFA World Cup 2026 All matches, match results. Mexico vs South Africa 2-0. South Korea vs Czechia 2-1. Canada vs Bosnia and Herzegovina 1-1. USA vs Paraguay 4-1. Qatar vs Switzerland 1-1. Brazil vs Morocco 1-1. Haiti vs Scotland 0-1. Australia vs Turkey 2-0. Germany vs Curacao 7-1. Netherlands vs Japan 2-2. Ivory Coast vs Ecuador 1-0. Sweden vs Tunisia 5-1. Spain vs Cape Verde 0-0. Belgium vs Egypt 1-1. Saudi Arabia vs Uruguay 1-1. Iran vs New Zealand 2-2. France vs Senegal 3-1. Iraq vs Norway 1-4. Argentina vs Algeria 3-0. Austria vs Jordan 3-1. Portugal vs DR Congo 1-1. England vs Croatia 4-2. Ghana vs Panama 1-0. Uzbekistan vs Colombia 1-3. Czechia vs South Africa 1-1. Switzerland vs Bosnia and Herzegovina 4-1. Canada vs Qatar 6-0. Mexico vs South Korea 1-0. USA vs Australia 2-0. Scotland vs Morocco 0-1. Brazil vs Haiti 3-0. Turkey vs Paraguay 0-1. Netherlands vs Sweden 5-1. Germany vs Ivory Coast 2-1. Ecuador vs Curacao 0-0. Tunisia vs Japan 0-4. Spain vs Saudi Arabia 4-0. Belgium vs Iran 0-0. Uruguay vs Cape Verde 2-2. New Zealand vs Egypt 1-3. Argentina vs Austria 2-0. France vs Iraq 3-0. Norway vs Senegal 3-2. Jordan vs Algeria 1-2. Portugal vs Uzbekistan 5-0. England vs Ghana 0-0. Paraguay vs Croatia 0-1. Colombia vs DR Congo 1-0. Switzerland vs Canada 2-1. Bosnia and Herzegovina vs Qatar 3-1. Morocco vs Haiti 4-2. Scotland vs Brazil 0-3. South Africa vs South Korea 1-0. Czechia vs Mexico 0-3. Curacao vs Ivory Coast 0-2. Ecuador vs Germany 2-1. Tunisia vs Netherlands 1-3. Japan vs Sweden 1-1. Turkey vs USA 3-2. Paraguay vs Australia 0-0. Norway vs France 1-4. Senegal vs Iraq 5-0. Cape Verde vs Saudi Arabia 0-0. Uruguay vs Spain 0-1. New Zealand vs Belgium 1-5. Egypt vs Iran 1-1. Panama vs England 0-2. Croatia vs Ghana 2-1. Colombia vs Portugal 0-0. DR Congo vs Uzbekistan 3-1. Algeria vs Austria 3-3. Jordan vs Argentina 1-3. South Africa vs Canada 0-1. Brazil vs Japan 2-1. Germany vs Paraguay 1-1. Netherlands vs Morocco 1-1. Ivory Coast vs Norway 1-2. France vs Sweden 3-0. Mexico vs Ecuador 2-0. England vs DR Congo 2-1. Belgium vs Senegal 3-2. USA vs Bosnia and Herzegovina 2-0. Spain vs Austria 3-0. Portugal vs Croatia 2-1. Switzerland vs Algeria 2-0. Australia vs Egypt 1-1. Argentina vs Cape Verde 3-2. Colombia vs Ghana 1-0. Canada vs Morocco 0-3. Paraguay vs France 0-1. Brazil vs Norway 1-2. Mexico vs England 2-3. Portugal vs Spain 0-1. USA vs Belgium 1-4. Argentina vs Egypt 3-2. Switzerland vs Colombia 0-0. France vs Morocco 2-0. Spain vs Belgium 2-1. Norway vs England 1-2. Argentina vs Switzerland 3-1. France vs Spain 0-2. England vs Argentina 1-2. France vs England 4-6. Spain vs Argentina 1-0.